We want to have as much energy for something that is going to be a challenge, growing intermodal, right? Healthy supply chain, growing intermodal. This is a challenge. We need all the smartest people, all the people who do this every day to be there, to be part of that discussion and really seek and help out with these challenges.
Freight doesn't move in silos, and neither should the conversation. Welcome to the Freight Table, a monthly podcast from the Intermodal Association of North America, connecting data, government affairs, and voices from across the intermodal supply chain. This is your pulse on what's changing now and what to watch next, where intermodal comes together.
So Chris, from the ground level, kind of on in the market, what is going on with intermodal?
Well, the market's alive again. Intermodal is becoming a lot more of the conversation than it has been for the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 years. You know, we had previously seen a good, I'd say decade of growth in intermodal where we saw a lot of freight coming over to the rails from the road. But in the course of the truck rates kind of plummeting, a lot of customers kind of were running back the other direction, and we saw freight leave the rates. But over the last 6 months, we've really seen that start to shift again. For whatever reason, the flipping of the calendar into January, the markets have just continued to kind of build and heat up on the truck scene, which as that has happened and some of the regulatory items have come through, we've just seen a constraint on capacity on the truck side that is, I think, more supply driven, something we've really honestly have not experienced in quite some time. And for that reason, we have a lot of customers on our side looking for what are the alternatives? What are the other options? I'd love to talk to you about rail again. We haven't chatted intermodal in a while. That's a good thing. So it's a very healthy space for intermodal. I'm really pleased to see it kind of gravitating back that way. And it's definitely become a more prevalent frontline conversation. We're definitely having intermodal discussions with a lot of customers that we haven't talked to them about it in a while or maybe ever. So the industry's in a good position here. I know there's a lot of question marks as to why all of this is going on. I think there's a confluence of factors to that, which if we all had the answers to it, we probably wouldn't be doing this. We've bet on different futures, but nonetheless, the market is looking very positive for intermodal.
That's great to hear because, we're certainly seeing it in the numbers. I mean, I think, our in-house economists in the past week, our intermodal in-depth flash report showed that I think we're about 14, almost 15% of freight that moved last week was done intermodally, which is a pretty good indication that things are moving in our direction, which is fantastic. Ann, what are you hearing? What do you think? You've been talking with members. You've been visiting on the Hill. What are your thoughts on the state of intermodal?
Yeah, I think Chris is exactly right. And just add to that fuel prices went through the roof earlier this year. We all know about the Strait of Hormuz. Chris was trying to get it back open. I think he's probably succeeded by now, more or less.
Well, we've already won the war like 5 times, so it just takes, maybe next time I'll get it open. I don't know.
That's what Chris, he does everything that he can for intermodal. But the point is that drove the prices for fuel so much higher. And since, railroads, intermodal specifically, are far more sustainable and can spread that cost across it's sort of whole transaction as opposed to truck, which is very sensitive to fuel price. We were able to be the beneficiary of that. So you had a capacity constraint, which Chris mentioned, and then this kind of pricing constraint, which really has driven a lot of folks to intermodal. Now, the question is, when those fuel prices start going back down, which they are we going to retain those same customers, those same contracts? And I think that'll be kind of the point of our discussion today, which is how do we do that?
Absolutely. That is the crux of today's discussion, which is, as Chris mentioned, there are people who are having these conversations about intermodal for the first time. And really, those are the people who, need to be educated about how intermodal can be very similar to what they experience with their over-the-road experience, where there's one point of contact. We can create that truck-like experience for them. So can we talk a little bit about how we help intermodal overcome some of these barriers where people don't quite understand how it all works? It's a black box, so to speak.
Well, so I'm going to just congratulate Chris because he's well-positioned, I think, to be an ambassador, a translator, a promoter, and really a manager of all that is intermodal. And the reason I say that is Chris is a part of a company called an Intermodal Marketing Company, an IMC. And those folks at IMCs are literally doing all of those tasks. It just says marketing in the title, but they are the critical linchpin in making an intermodal transaction from soup to nuts work, because they have visibility into all of that. And further, the IMCs are making investments, whether it's technology for visibility, whether it's technology just to have some kind of, collaborative language across the transaction from the ocean carrier to the dray to the railroad. They're making those investments. And so that the shipper doesn't have to really worry. They can have a truck-like product, and they can work with companies like Chris's company to have that conversation without having to know what the ins and outs of intermodal are. Now, intermodal is more complicated, but it doesn't have to be somehow worse because it's complicated. It can be just as good if you have the right partners making it understandable to you.
Yeah, I think you're dead on, Ann, and it's fun to be in this position. It's fun to take a solution that is complex. When you hire a truck, it's moving from A to B. When you move intermodal, it's like there's a lot more folks involved. It's A to D or A to E by the time it's done. There's a lot of different parties that are involved. I think the fun part of what we do as an IMC is to have all the partnerships, both on the customer and the vendor side, working with some of the best draymen in the country, getting freight. There are visibility to the customer. That's the person they're seeing, so building great relationships there and kind of piecing the puzzle together. And it is a complex world, but it's not a hard one to execute within the supply chain, especially now. And I think in my time as chair, I think what's been a lot of fun, and even just my time on the board, we've really focused on educating people on intermodal and finding different ways to kind of bring it down to uncomplicate it a bit so that it's not as daunting when you do want to roll it out. And it really should be a part of people's long-term strategy. It's a great hedge for market capacity issues. It's a great play for sustainability. There's a lot to it, and they're not always thinking about all those components. So it is fun. I'll definitely take that. It's a fun spot to be and have a pulse on things, but also be able to go out there and say, hey, we've got a great thing going here, and it's really exciting. A lot of times it's shaking the stigma. A lot of people picture, an old boxcar train just slowly chugging along. They're not picturing that. This is, an 80 mile per hour Z train that's going to be solo truck competitive coming off the coast. It's different, just bringing them up to speed on what it really is. You just picture a train, you don't think fast. And I think there are a lot of spots, especially if you deploy it correctly, it can fill the gap of a lot of different capacity that you have today. So no, it's a fun way to be right now. That's for sure.
In terms of, in making intermodal stick, so to speak, as the market, continues to adjust to dropping fuel prices, and freight, and the amount of freight increases with whatever peak season we may be seeing. How do we, as an intermodal community and industry, kind of present that longer term, as Ann was saying, that longer term prospect? How do we hold on to this freight once it kind of makes the transition and they're giving intermodal a try for the first time? What are going to be the key factors that will determine whether or not they continue working with intermodal moving forward, in your opinion?
One of the nice things about intermodal, David, is around, the railroads will commit to you. If you bring a freight to the railroad, they're going to commit to you. If you have annual volumes and you can bring those, that rate's going to be stable. Capacity, generally that could be planned once they know what's going to happen in terms of volume and what you're going to drive out of certain markets. So there is a stability component to it that I think is a little underestimated at times, because that rate's going to stay stable. A lot of these for higher volume situations become not set it and forget it, but it becomes very patterned. It becomes the same driver showing up for those drop and hooks. And, to me, that brings a great service component to your supply chain. And, does it take a minute or two to get that established? Absolutely. Just like any new piece of business. I always say it takes 6 weeks for a new piece of business to truly come on board, settle in. And so you have to give it that time, because there are, going to be bumps in the road. You're going to learn things about how you load an intermodal shipment versus a truck, load or something along those lines. So to me, that's a key part, is kind of sticking to the strategy and leveraging that and saying, hey, Mr. Railroad, I have X amount of freight here. What can we do together? And we're always happy to make those connections. And, for us, I think that's a big part of it. And I just think the overall hedge, I think we just experienced the volatility of the market kind of swinging back really hard. And my team is probably tired of me saying this kind of metaphor for it all, but our industry used to be a lot of hills and valleys. You would feel it building and you'd feel it kind of waning as it was coasting down. It's an EKG now. It just turns on and off. It's like a light switch. It just goes to full panic or, hey, everything's horrible. It seems like there's no middle and there's no like lead up. So, sticking to the strategy to soften some of that volatility, I think is really an important thing as well. Say, okay, this is intermodal. We can plan for the transit if it's a day or so longer. We can use weekends to our advantage. We can do things like that. And you can build a very, very solid model around it. There's plenty out there that have done it, but I think there's plenty that still can. So to me, stability is a big factor, and that comes from a few fronts.
Yeah, and Chris is modest too, but he has, and I won't name his customer or his railroad, but he has a tri-party contract with his customer on the one end and the railroad on the other. And so why is that important? Well, because they all know each other and they understand their expectations. And it's important for the collaboration to ultimately mean that they have the successful length of a contract where the service levels are predictable, and where the customer feels like he's being heard, and there's an understanding amongst all parties of how to make it work. I think for the future of intermodal, that to me seems like such a great model. Having a service level expectation for the railroads, I think, is incredibly important. A commitment to growth from the IMC, incredibly important. And a BCO who wants to shift their modal focus away from sort of your easy modal focus to one that may make much more sense because you're using the highest, best use of each mode. We're in the middle of our PR campaign, which I'm sure we'll touch on in a little bit. There's a lot of discovery still being done about what our shippers think of intermodal. But to me, that could be one of the outcomes that they tell us is there's a greater appreciation and understanding and hope for collaboration across the transaction.
And I think the railroads, Anna, are really leaning into that, and for us being an intermediary, we have feelings kind of both ways about that. These are a lot of relationships that we've taken years to cultivate, but the railroads want to be with the customers. They want to explain the investments they're making. When you're putting $2 billion a year just in the infrastructure, you want to tell people about that. You have a good product. So I think it's been really fun to have those kind of, all those parties in the room together explaining the value of the railroads, and they've gotten very good at that. And I commend all of them. They all kind of have their national account teams that support us and the customer. And those are fun calls to make because you genuinely learn something every time. Every time I'm with the railroads, I seem to learn a new nuance of how they do what they do. And the customer really appreciates that. And it does take the sting out of like the new factor of having to do something different when the railroad can say, okay, here's how we're going to go about it. And to us, we really enjoy when that happens. And I definitely want to commend all the class ones on their support of how they're approaching the customers that are out there.
That's all great because I do, I think that really is one of the strong points, one of many of the strong points, which is that routine, that predictability in the cycle of freight moving, that I think that is really important, and I think is probably very attractive for a lot of BCOs. I want to touch a little bit, if we can go back. And talk a little bit more about the naming convention of IMCs, and if we think that is a hindrance to people really understanding what you do, Chris, on a daily basis, and kind of what your role is, and how do you explain that when you're working with a new customer? Do they get it right away, or do they kind of just blow past it?
It depends. If they're in the rail space or they've done intermodal, they certainly know what it is. It's funny, as I came into the business, and I always say I'm one of the only idiots that got into this willingly. Usually you fall into transportation, but in school you learn some jargon, but you don't learn a lot. And when I saw that name, I remember learning that when I was at Marquette, and I didn't see well, are they marketing? What are they doing? It confused me as I first saw it. So it's probably not the greatest nomenclature. Most people would refer to us more as an intermodal provider. A non-asset IMC has been more the term, but I don't know that they even know what that always all means, right? So yeah, I do think we probably could look into, I don't know how we shift it entirely within an industry, but I do think it does have a little bit of a jargony connotation to it that likely is not the ideal that we'd like to go by. But, it is definitely, I think amongst the ones that know it's okay, but you're dead on with how do we bring that to market and let people know what it is that we do, and that we're not just helping them sell commercials, and be a marketing agency. So But yeah, I do think it has a bit of, maybe it's datedness to it. It's a bit descriptive of what we do. I had a boss that he always described it as we're a travel agent for freight, right? So when you book your trip to Hawaii, you need to book an airfare and hotel and maybe car service. Basically what we're doing, we're taking all those things, we're putting them onto one bill for you, into one order. And, just does IMC, does Intermodal Marketing Company sum that up? Not necessarily in my head either, So I do think that's something that as an industry we can look towards, because there is a difference between being just a broker and an IMC. That's something that we have both in-house. We function on both fronts, and some of the access that IMCs have to the railroads far exceeds what, basic intermodal offerings a typical broker could give as well.
And Ann, I know you've had some conversations about this as well, and kind of what have you been hearing about this nomenclature and kind of how it sits with potential BCO customers?
Yeah, I think Chris is right. It's not necessarily somehow, an albatross around the neck of an IMC that the name is not entirely explanatory. But it is something that could probably be just talked about, potentially improved, maybe as part of really, again, we're talking about this PR campaign, maybe just part of a larger discussion about how do we sell intermodal better? We don't want intermodal just to be sold when oil prices are high and capacity is shrunken, trunk capacity is shrunken. We want it to be the long game. And so if changing the name of IMC is part of that, maybe that does make sense, because they do so much more than market to a BCO. They're running point, right? That's what they're doing. So yeah, I think we just think about, okay, we talk about how we're sustainable. We talk about the highest, best use of the mode. We talk about how we are the volume producers, but how do we do that in a way that really makes sense? Because truck can be so easy, right? So I think that's part of our continuing effort and education.
And I want to, if you don't mind, I want to kind of stick with that education theme and shift it just a little bit. One of the biggest issues I think that's coming out of every conference that I have been to this year, and I'm sure you all are tired of hearing the word as well, but artificial intelligence, kind of what does that mean to an industry that is kind of has fragmented data sets and isn't necessarily good about communicating, has certain things they need to communicate across the supply chain, but they're not necessarily always speaking the same language. How does technology help intermodal? And also what do we have to overcome to really reap the benefits of technology and AI in the intermodal space?
I think AI can help certainly with cohesion across the modes. But to your point about the challenge around that, we have a lot of legacy systems, like not technology early adopters. We're talking about ocean carriers and railroads and trucks. I mean, these things, we've been around a really, really long time. And so these have all developed their own kind of languages over time. So the challenge, and we have some really smart people who are helping us with this, is how do we talk to each other in a way that makes sense? How do we leverage AI? And so that there is this continuity across the transaction where everybody has an understanding about what is going where it is right now, and when it will get there. So I'm not necessarily an AI expert, but thank goodness we have some AI experts who are willing to volunteer their time and their talent to help us really make sense of this. Because yes, we're not early adopters. We're not the cool hipsters that hang out in Silicon Valley, but we're starting to bring those folks into the fold, and they will help operationalize what we want to do, which is really collaborate.
How do we take data? How do we take in information? How do we respond to things? How do we clean what we're looking at? And the AI from that perspective, as we optimize things for our customers, is pretty incredible. When you look at what the railroads are doing with AI, just in terms of, the way they're monitoring equipment as it's moving along, with some of the events they've had, the tragedies they've had with different derailments or accidents, the trackside monitoring, how AI is weighing into that and looking at heat and temperature and visual and sound all in milliseconds. It's pretty incredible. And as they go to different predictable indexes and learning through all that, I do think it's a very exciting space. I'll say I think it's a time right now where reminds me of blockchain a bit, where everyone's like everything's AI. But what is it going to be? What is the true application? Because there's some things it's very applicable for. There's other times I go out to use it and I'm kind of like, well, I could have just done that manually a lot faster through other means. So it's interesting to see that conversation come into focus. And my team has seen it at a few of the shows that we've been out to. David, kind of like you, like last year, everyone was like, AI, we can change your whole office. We can do everything you want. This year was different. They were like, we do this for AI. We think you should focus right here. It was people are getting a little more targeted, realizing, okay, it's not just a shotgun approach at this. It's not just going to be a Band-Aid you can throw on anything. It still requires a lot of logic. It still requires, a lot of structure that you have to set those terms for. And is it going to be a vehicle for the future? Absolutely. It's not going anywhere. It's just what are the right applications to put your capital behind. And at Radian, we have several very exciting projects that kind of take the AI and tie in with some of our tech stack, with some of our tracking platforms called Navigate and a few other things. So, we're finding those little opportunities and really trying to exploit those for the betterment of our customer base and efficiencies and all that. But, it goes right down to the track level. It goes down to how those locomotives are planned. There's just so many little spots that's being used. It's just going to continue to drive, I think, new thought processes and faster turnarounds on some of these concepts, modeling and different things like that. That's definitely going to be a good product of AI. And you're right, and we're late. The transportation industry is slow as a whole. The rail industry and intermodal, we're trailing quite a bit. So it's fun to see a bit of a tech renaissance. We're seeing it come out. We're not, I think, at the cutting edge, like you said. We're not hanging out in Silicon Valley, but we're trying to get a taste, which is cool.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, just to hone in on what you said, Chris, is we're not doing performative technology, which is not my expression, but is so great. I love that, because performative technology is just buying whatever anyone sells you without thoughtful intention about how you're going to deploy it. I think we're really trying to have intentional technology, which is, if we're going to start investing in this, how best can we use it, and what's going to give you the most bang for your buck?
Yeah.
I understand it, because Chris and I met. I used to be at TIA, the Transportation Intermediaries Association. They have a conference called Technovations. And at that Technovations, it's almost overwhelming how many different technology solutions there are. And you feel like, oh my gosh, should I just buy all of them? But really, you've got to play it smart and figure out what is the problem I'm looking to solve? And is this the biggest problem I have? Or is it just one of them? And I could actually go up here and get something else that's actually the challenge here, instead of just monitoring my emails coming in, which is important, but is that the biggest problem? Maybe I could work on something else.
Day to day, like, what is our tolerance for dealing with AI? As you think about, you have a problem with a package and you call somewhere and you need to talk to someone and you realize you're talking to an AI agent. I mean, that's a really cool thing that's out there, the whole AI agent, and they're going to find out for tracking information, or they're going to go do some of that phone work for you. But do we all want to do that every day? No, I'm going to push the buttons until I get an actual human being. So I do think there's applications. We'll find those tolerances. I think for some of it, it's fantastic. And it's amazing to see how fast it is moving. It'll be very exciting to see what sticks. What is the thing we really solve with it as an industry? And like I said, I think that comes down from maintenance all the way to performance. It's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out, to be honest.
I think the interesting perspective too for me is for an industry that's built so much on relationships, on personal relationships, that you suddenly are looking to inject artificial intelligence to help solve some of the issues where someone else would just pick up the phone and call you, Chris, for instance. They may not in the future. They may be directed somewhere else.
The robots can be our friends. Don't forget that.
Robots don't gang up on him. That's why he's saying it. He's protecting himself.
I say please and thank you to Siri all the time.
Good. I think everyone should go back and watch Terminator 2 just to be safe. I mean, like, it's not happening right now. Just calling it out. So you heard it here first.
It's very important. I agree. One other kind of BCO related topic that I think is always of interest is how do you mitigate their concern about cargo theft and having the safety of their cargo that they're entrusting to you. How do you handle those conversations in light of what's been going on?
Well, it's at the forefront. Everybody's leading with that. I'm going to definitely, I'd love Ann to speak a little bit on our cargo theft task force. I won't steal that thunder because I think that's been an early product of Ann coming over. And some of the adjustments we made as a board of what we're focused on with our working groups. They want to know more. They want to know what are the ways we can prevent it. What are the things they could be doing, and they do all have a threshold. There's plenty of devices and things you can put in your container or your trailer. Just what's it worth to risk, no different than any insurance policy you ever have. Is it worth the risk of what's going on to the freight? So it's definitely at the forefront. I think the rails have done a good job with some of the en-route security. We've definitely, those things still happen where a container might get popped open, but the spots that they know are hot spots, they've done a good job of trying to mitigate those opportunities for things to be pilfered, which is positive. But it's a top of the list conversation with every customer. But I'll say the guide that our committee put together, and I'll have Ann speak to, has been very powerful, very useful. The data in it's great. So Ann, why don't you share a little bit about that? Because I think that's a pretty exciting turn for us that we got people focused on.
Sure. So we started this task force because, we felt like we were screaming into the wind, honestly, that there was such a huge problem and it either wasn't getting heard or it wasn't getting addressed or both. And so we thought, look, we have a combined, really weighty voice in these matters. Let's talk about it. And so we were able to put together this task force. We have a couple great co-chairs, Greg Zodi and Mike Dickmeyer from BNSF and UP, respectively. And so one of the first tasks they had was to put together this recommended practices. And that all stemmed from one of our folks saying, look, it will be more powerful if it comes from the association and not just from my company or from me to say, this is what we are doing. And this is what really is a recommended practice for the entire industry, because it's not just the transportation provider that needs to take on prevention, detection, and enforcement. It's everybody. So the beneficial cargo owner needs to be part of that solution. And so what can they do that's actually helpful? And then the transportation provider, and then the IMC, what can they do? And the IMC, typically, it's investing in all kinds of technology, right, to make sure that you know where things are where they should be. And then the owner of the, dray carrier, so that they are, sure that they have the right container number and that they're all tracking the paperwork, so to speak. And then the driver's the right driver. And we know that driver has been allowed onto the facility because all this stuff that happened beforehand. One of the things that's interesting, so we're part of a coalition that is trying to get some more enforcement around cargo theft. Because the reason we felt like we were screaming in the wind was there really hasn't been much enforcement at all. And for varying reasons. Some because they just don't have the resources from a state or federal level. And some because there are some states that were concerned about prosecuting what they don't believe is really serious criminal behavior. So the point that we've tried to make is that this is not just your petty theft here where a guy's cracking open a container and they got a way to bust open the lock. These are actual sophisticated criminal gangs that are doing these things. And so that kind of takes it from being this kind of worry to this kind of worry, and something that the federal folks should take action on. So we continue to push on that kind of legislation that would give them greater tools and certainly more resources, so they can't plead poverty and say, we can't look into this. We just don't have the resources. But, I've said this a billion times, but when I talk to the FBI guy in DC, one guy at the FBI who's supposed to be in charge of theft. So not just cargo theft, but like retail theft and, right? I mean, that's crazy. So what are we doing? So that's why it's like, it takes all of us saying this is a problem that has to be addressed. And you can't just have one guy talking about theft at the FBI. That's bananas. So, we continue to push on that.
I think that's one of the hardest things, for any side of the industry, whether you're on the roadside, brokering trucks, or you're on the intermodal side. When something does happen, to get anyone's attention to care about it, we could report it to the police. They don't care. It's not the right station. Not my jurisdiction. Doesn't matter where it originated. It got stolen. I don't know where it's at. I don't know where to report it. the lack of action from law enforcement sometimes, because they don't know where to start. I'm not necessarily faulting them by any means. It is a very tough spot with fraud, and they are so creative in how they're going about things. And every time you get an angle blocked off, they find another one, and it is a very, very fluid situation. And, I had the pleasure of joining Ann up on the Hill a few weeks ago, and the Corca bill is kind of making its way through. And, to see the support from the legislators around that was really cool, because I thought, okay, some other people are listening. They're getting it. They know it's important. They know it's something we've got to address. And it really dawned on me at that point, like that's where associations like IANA and any industry association, how important they are to these various industries, because, we as operators can't think about all these legislative things that are happening or what we should even be talking about sometimes at that higher level. So having the associations there to back that up and lobby and have those conversations and jury have support for it, I think is a really important thing that really dawned on me from seeing that firsthand. So it's good to see it's got some attention.
That is that is absolutely true. We really and we appreciate our members coming in. And Chris, like you did, you went and went with Ann on some Hill visits, which I think is fantastic, because you really get a sense of kind of how legislators are thinking and what they're looking for in terms of feedback and input to the decisions they're making that affect all of us.
One thing that is just, it's really promotional of government affairs in our association, but this is the cargo theft issue is such a great example of, we have a lot of modes that we represent that are part of intermodal. And I think the complaint you hear is, how can they agree on anything? Well, yes, there are probably fewer issues that the trucks, the trains, the IMCs, the ocean carriers, and the ports can agree on than perhaps their own respective organizations. However, they care about the supply chain. And when you have a threat such as cargo theft that really threatens the supply chain and American competitiveness and raising prices for customers, et cetera, that's something we can all galvanize on. And I will tell you, that's what's important is, we are looking at these big picture issues. We have kind of that overview because we don't represent one particular mode. We represent all of them. We can be a little bit dispassionate and say, here's what's actually going to help the supply chain. These are the issues that we care about, whether it's surface transportation reauthorization, whatever the issue may be, whether it's an independent driver, if it's truck parking, whatever. What's going to help the supply chain. And that's how we think about it. And I've been so gratified by the response that we've received from our members, because this is a relatively new function for us. And they all are really committed. And just, Chris going to Capitol Hill, we hope, maybe it's not next year, maybe it's 2028, but we hope to have something like that where we bring a number of members in to really have that experience too, because it is kind of, it can change your mind and change your heart just by participating in that.
Yeah, it was eye-opening. Yeah. We had a great day. You didn't get me to the UFC fight that you promised me on the White House lawn, but we did have a great time. Just seeing it happen and hearing how educated the staffers are and how passionate they are to get these things done, that they're putting a lot of effort behind. I think them educating us even sometimes of all the things that are coming through, it would be very beneficial to keep that dialogue open. I think that was part of the reason, and we were very excited to have Ann join our organization because she's done a lot of that in previous stints. So I'll say I'll vouch for her. She knows her way around the Hill very well. So
I didn't get Chris lost one time.
Wow.
Which is a feat, because those hallways all start to look the same after a while.
They sure do. The highlight of the day, I'll divert for a second, David, for an entertaining story. So we're in between meetings with a few senators, and we're in this we found a little cafeteria type area. It was down in the lower office, and I stepped away for a minute, make a call, and I came back. And Ann looks at me and goes, "Hey, it's your lucky day. Like, this is a really good day to be here." I'm like, "Oh my God, dude, is the president here, vice president, and is Obama going to walk through? What's going to happen?" She goes, "Hey, right over there, that's Richard Gere." And I'm like, "What, the actor?" And she goes, "Yeah." I'm like, okay. And sure enough, there he was. He looks great. He was on the Hill for something, but it was so funny just how much is happening in Washington in one day.
It's a good day when Richard Gere is in town.
It was. He was right there.
That's awesome. I love that. You all are leading right into where I wanted to go next, which is, what role does IANA play in all of these conversations? What role can it play? And what role Chris as a member, as the chair of the board of directors, and Anne as the president and CEO, what role do you want to see IANA play moving into the future?
Well, ladies first on this one. I'll defer to Anne.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to call myself an elder statesman because I'm not old yet, but well, maybe I am old. I don't know. But the whole point of having a multimodal organization, one that's sort of unified around the container, is again, we are promotional of the health of the nation's supply chain. We want healthy railroads, we want healthy dray carriers, we want healthy ocean carriers, we want healthy ports and terminals, healthy vendors, et cetera, healthy, chassis providers, all of those folks. And so what that means is, how can we best serve you knowing that that's our goal? Goal number 1 is a healthy supply chain. Goal number 2 is grow intermodal, right? And so in 1 and 2, how do we do that? And I really think having people's voices heard is part of that, making sure that they are part of the committee process, meaning we're actually talking about really meaty things. So we've already talked about AI. We have a committee looking at AI. What about the future of AV, right? So we know that there's kind of this crazy dichotomy right now where you have an AV framework for trucks being created and a mandate for a 2-person crew on railroads. So how do we negotiate that future, and how do we think about AV? So if it is coming to trucks and maybe eventually to trains, we don't know. How do we think about the safety of that? How do we think about operationalizing that? How do we think about liability for that? And so really, we need the smart people who belong to this association, who are committed to a healthy supply chain and growing intermodal, to be part of that, because anything we do needs to have those 2 missions in mind.
And I think what's unique about our association is, like, as Anne was kind of alluding to, how wide our member base is. We're really covering a lot of territory. And as a board, there's oftentimes we do want to stick our nose into something and make a statement about something, but we do have to be mindful of, well, this might support this one area of the association, but other membership, it may, be kind of against what they're going for. So it is a delicate balance for the association to kind of shoot that gap at times. And to me, I like a lot of the direction we're heading. I think IANA has always been, for the intermodal side of life, one of the best unifiers of the industry in terms of getting people together. I do think our expo has always been the cornerstone of that. We have a lot of great movement as folks have seen some of the announcements around changes we are making to it to try to reinvigorate it. But at its core, it's gotten everybody together, and it happens every year. And I think that that's a very positive thing. But now, how do we drive that value? How do we take their passions and let the association kind of ride that energy in ways that will better it for everybody? And so I think a lot of the stuff we're doing on the lobbying side, I think the data side, our new economist, some of the things he's working on are just phenomenal. There's a lot of really exciting things that are going to come from some of the data he's plugging and, delivering that value. And we want to be that go-to. I think as a board, we've made a collective vote and movement towards, when something happens in the intermodal space, we want the phone call. We want IANA to be the one that's on the camera saying, this is what's happening, or this is why this happened, or this is how it's going to get better. So I really applaud all of our board members over the last, I think it's my 5th year on the board. It's really been a lot of fun to move the needle. When Joni ran it, and now when Anne's running it, there's just a lot of good energy and a lot of people that want to make a difference for the betterment of all of our membership and the industry. So it is cool to see us doing a lot of different things and being more vocal on some of the legislation and, really trying to weigh in on cutting edge stuff like AI. I don't know that we would have had as much focus on that. I think we're, if I had to describe the type of folks that are in intermodal, we're more tactical, right? We're there assembling that shipment. We understand, you have to understand the grassroots of how it all works. And so I think I think for a while we were caught up a bit on, well, how do we improve all those little things, which are really important? And we're still doing those things, how do we look at doing M&R on a chassis, and, what is the right thing for roadability, and, what is the correct train speed to know that we have a good network? But I think we're branching out our effort and our focus quite a bit, and it's very deliberate. It is very much the direction as a board we wanted to take, and I applaud the staff at IANA in Maryland there for getting behind it and really running with it. So,
thank you. That was amazing. Is there anything closing remarks? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to cover while you have this opportunity? Anything that comes to mind as in, something in the next 30, 60, 90, 120 days?
I have something.
Uh-oh.
Intermodal Expo, September 14th through the 16th in Long Beach, California. Now, look, people have been going to Long Beach, California for the Intermodal Expo for years. As Chris mentioned, though, we're shaking it up. We're changing the experience. We also are going to start going to different cities. We're going to do a rotation between Long Beach and another city starting in 2028. And the point of that is we want to have as much energy for something that is going to be a challenge, growing intermodal, right? Healthy supply chain, growing intermodal. This is a challenge. We need all the smartest people, all the people who do this every day to be there, to be part of that discussion and really seek and help out with these challenges. We talked about the IMC name. We're going to have a separate session just on that. We're going to have a session on this PR campaign that we talked about because there's going to be so many fascinating things. We're going to have a session on growth. And I think, too, the last thing, we haven't talked about it and we don't need to opine on it because Lord knows there's plenty of people opining on it. But we're going to have a discussion from Jim Venna and Katie Farmer, where they're going to make their contrary cases on the sort of virtues or not of a big multi-1,000-mile merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern. And that to me is also critical in this discussion about intermodal success, because whether you're for it or against it, everyone's talking about intermodal. To go back to your original point, David, about why we're in this moment, that's part of it too, that there is a lot of focus on this being the future for railroads.
Yeah, and I think, we're beyond excited for those expo changes, and there's a few things behind the curtain we haven't even unveiled yet that are going to be coming out shortly, and just should begin to evolve it. But, it's an exciting time for intermodal, but it's a pivotal time. I think, I've heard from several customers, and I had a salesman kind of surmise it for me once down to when a customer has a bad experience with a trucker, they move on and they use, trucker B. They go from trucker A to trucker B. Sometimes when they have a bad experience with intermodal, they just go, wow, intermodal is horrible. I'm going to go back to truck. And so a lot of our job is to educate why they don't always have to do that. There's obviously, it's still transportation. Things go wrong with trucks as well. But, at its core, when the shock absorber of intermodal for capacity, which is often what it is in kind of called to the stage, it needs to perform. And we're hopeful that with the investments the railroads have made, and we've seen some early trials here that it's held up very well. They need to perform. They need to show a consistent product through this. And especially if they want to demonstrate that the merger is the right answer, how are they going to operate through a moment where we're in a tougher moment? We're not in the easy moment of what the last 3 years was. They should have run good networks in those 3 years, and they did. They were running fast trains. So I think this is a really, as we look forward here in the next, into peak season in the next 4 to 6 months, it's going to be very interesting to see overall what the market dynamic does. I do believe truck rates are going to stay elevated. The market is just too volatile still right now. And fuel was a driver, but not the only catalyst. So I think intermodal has a play here, but it's a critical time. And the infrastructure underneath it needs to hold up, and we need to see that continue. So I'm very optimistic, and like I said, we've been enjoying some very, very fun conversations, getting people to come over the fence and jump back on the rails. So we'll see if it continues.
Well, Ann and Chris, this has been an outstanding conversation, as I knew it would be. Thank you so very much. I appreciate both of you sharing your insights and your expertise and your experience. So with that, thank you both very much.